Hello, my name is Ian Gilliland, and this is my audition, if you will, for the District World Schools application. This is for the District World Schools team in the big 2026. So, all right, let's go ahead and get started. The right to be forgotten is really the right to disconnect your present from your past, to curate a fiction of yourself, Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks. That's really what this motion is asking us to accept. We must reject this premise. What sounds like compassion on the surface is actually hiding something far more dangerous underneath. This is why we proudly oppose today's motion. This House believes an individual has the right to be forgotten. In the opposition's first speech, I'll lay out our definitions and framing, walk through our two substantive arguments, and then move on to attack the proposition's claims. Before the opposition's substantives, let's go over some definitions. First, we define individual as any person seeking the removal of information about themselves from public records, search engines, or digital platforms. We define the right to be forgotten as a legal entitlement allowing individuals to demand deletion of personal information, even when that information is accurate, lawfully obtained, and publicly relevant. Now, that last part actually matters. We're not simply talking about protecting your passwords or your medical records. We're talking about erasing true information that the public has a legitimate interest in knowing. Again, that is what this motion is actually about. I have 2 points of framing. They are, first, this motion isn't about protecting private data, it's about suppressing truthful public information. None of us is actually against privacy, but there's a real difference between protecting genuine private information and erasing accurate, publicly relevant records. This motion covers both, and that's exactly the problem. Second, the right exists in tensions with others, and the right to be forgotten consistently loses. The right to truth, the right to a free press, the right to hold power accountable, these aren't abstract ideas, they're the foundation of our social contract. When the right to be forgotten collides with other rights, it doesn't win. We're going to show you why. First, our first substantive, the right to be forgotten is a tool for the powerful to escape accountability. Here's the truth about this motion. The people who benefit most from a right to be forgotten are not the most vulnerable people that the proposition wants you to actually picture. They're the people with the most resources, the best lawyers, and the most to hide. Think about who actually files these requests. After the EU established a limited version of this right in 2014, the removal requests started flooding in. A doctor wanted negative patient reviews taken down. A man convicted of possessing child abuse images wanted that record scrubbed. Of course he did. Politicians wanted coverage of their misconduct erased. Of course they did. These are real cases. This is what the right to be forgotten looks like in practice. We aren't seeing examples of redemption, instead, escape. And this makes complete sense when you actually think about it. The right to be forgotten doesn't help the ordinary person who made a mistake at 19 years old. It helps the person with enough legal filepower to exercise it, which is almost always someone with power and or money. This matters for 2 specific reasons. First, it destroys accountability for public figures. A politician convicted of fraud, a doctor struck off for malpractice, a company fined for dumping chemicals into a river. Under this motion, each could demand that accurate, documented, publicly relevant records be removed from public access, not because the records are wrong, but because they have the right to be forgotten. That's not privacy, that's impunity. There is a real difference. Second, it attacks the foundations of journalism and historical records. Investigative journalism depends on the premise of information. When a reporter is covering a politician today, they need to be able to reference what that politician did, say, 5 years ago. When a historian documents institutional abuse, they need records to remain accessible. When a community wants to know whether its local official has a pattern of misconduct, that information ought to exist. The right to be forgotten gives individuals the power to remove those records, not because the records are inaccurate, but because they're simply inconvenient. The impact of this is pretty straightforward. A right to be forgotten systematically advantages people with power and resources at the public's expense, denying the public's right to know what's true. That is not a right worth protecting. Our second substantive, the right to be forgotten, doesn't work. Even if you wanted this right to exist, it simply doesn't function in our real world, and the attempt to enforce it creates serious problems of its own. First, it's unenforceable. The intent is global, and the internet is global and decentralized. When the EU orders Google to de-index something, say in France, it stays up on Google in the United States. It stays on archive sites. It stays on foreign databases. Anyone who downloaded it, screenshotted it, or cached it still has it. The information doesn't disappear, it just becomes slightly harder to find for the people least equipped to find it. And there's another problem. Attempts to erase information online often have the opposite effect. The moment you legally demand something be taken down, you draw more attention to it than it ever would have received on its own. The legal mechanism creates the illusion of erasure while achieving almost nothing in reality. Also, the attempt to enforce it silences legitimate speech. Here's what happens when you make platforms legally liable for hosting information that someone claims they have a right to erase. The platforms don't carefully evaluate each case, they often overcomply. They take down anything that might expose them to a lawsuit, including accurate news articles, legitimate court records, public interest reporting. All of it becomes vulnerable, not because it is wrong, but because someone with a lawyer says they'd rather it not exist. A right designed to protect individuals ends up systematically suppressing truthful, publicly important information, not through malice, but through the basic logic of legal risk management. That's a chilling effect on free expression, and it's a direct consequence of this very motion. Now, let me move on to address what the proposition is claiming. First, they're claiming that people deserve second chances. Past mistakes shouldn't follow you forever. We don't disagree. Rehabilitation matters, people grow, people change. But here's what the proposition fails to explain. Why does giving someone a second chance require erasing the truth? A person can move forward with their life without demanding that accurate records cease to exist. These two things are not the same. There are already mechanisms for this: spent conviction legislation, data prevention frameworks, and time-based restrictions on what employers can actually ask you about. These protect people without handing everyone a legal right to rewrite their own history. The proposition's argument, if you follow it to its logical conclusion, would justify expunging criminal records, retracting published court judgments, and pulling news archives. At that point, we're simply not talking about privacy. They're telling us the internet never forgets, and that causes disproportional harm in the digital age. This is actually the proposition's strongest point, and I want to be fair to it. Digital permanence is a real problem. An embarrassing photo from 15 years ago, a minor offense that keeps resurfacing, these cause genuine harm, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. But the answer to disproportionate digital persistence is proportional regulation, not an absolute individual right to demand erasure. You can address this through contextual data protection laws that govern how platforms surface old, actual information. You can address it through platform responsibility that holds companies accountable for amplifying harmful content. What we cannot do is hand every individual a blanket right to demand the removal of accurate, legal obtained information, because that right will not stay within its intended boundaries. They're also claiming privacy is a fundamental human right. Yes, it is, and the opposition is not arguing otherwise. But no right is absolute. Every democracy that recognizes privacy also recognizes that it has to be balanced against other rights: freedom of expression, freedom of the press, the public's right to access information, the right to accountability. Privacy protects you from intrusion into your personal life. It does not give you the power to control what other people are allowed to know about you when it's true and when it matters. The right to be forgotten sounds like it's on the side of the individual. It sounds compassionate, it sounds modern. But when you look at who actually uses it, what it actually does, and what it actually costs, the picture changes completely. It's a mechanism for the powerful to escape accountability. It is technically unenforceable in any meaningful way, and the attempt to enforce it chills free expression and suppresses the truth. For all these reasons, the opposition proudly stands.